Good afternoon. I'm going to go ahead and get started. So my name is Jena. I'm a partner here at Fourlane. And for today's topic, we are going to be discussing what happens when you have a corrupt file and what the next steps are to try and resolve that. I would say it's a fun topic, but we all know we don't like the idea of corruption to our system or database. However, what we're going to talk through today is to help identify ways that we can prevent this, as well as how to respond if our file does become corrupt. Some common examples of corruption that you could be experiencing in your QuickBooks file include things like your QuickBooks software freezing or randomly aborting. Sometimes the action you're performing won't respond in QuickBooks and the software will stop working. And likely most times it will just shut down altogether and require you to reboot the system. In addition to that, sometimes the action you're trying to attempt in QuickBooks might not be responsive. So if you're looking to run a report, QuickBooks might not pull up that information right away, if at all, or it may require you asking QuickBooks to do that action multiple times before the software finally responds. This next one is a big one. So transactional data that could be missing. One of the things that some of you might have heard of is a phrase called target chaining errors. What target chaining errors are is damage to the transactional information inside of your company file. Some of the ways that you're able to see that this is present is if information is missing on the transaction itself. That could be in the form of things like the name or date field being empty. Another example is if the sign of the transaction is reversed. So for example, an invoice, we would expect to have a positive amount. However, if it's damaged by target chaining errors, the invoice might show a negative balance that's due, which we know would be incorrect. So this is a very big one because it has a huge impact on our reporting information and how QuickBooks is able to read that financial data. Sometimes you may also not be able to perform a certain action in a specific module. So similar to when I had mentioned QuickBooks not responding to your attempt to run a report, sometimes the action you ask the software to do isn't allowed altogether. We tend to see this a lot in the sales tax area. So for example, if you attempt to pay sales tax through that pay sales tax liability feature, QuickBooks may not allow you to do that, and you're forced to enter an alternative entry, and that liability ends up staying open, which again is not the result we want. We want that liability to be paid down. So that is another example of where QuickBooks not responding to what you're trying to do could be an indicator of corruption in the QuickBooks file. Now, once we've identified that our file is experiencing issues on a regular basis, what are some of the things that we can do to resolve these issues? The very first one is going to be verifying and rebuilding the file. For this, I'm going to go ahead and bring up our QuickBooks file to show where we run those utilities. In my QuickBooks file here, if I come up to our File tab and to our Utilities section, we've got a handful of actions that we can do. Towards the bottom of this list, we see that verify and rebuild data. We always recommend starting with the verify of the file because what this does first is it allows the QuickBooks software to be read, and it will give you an output log of errors that it identified so you can see what issues are showing in the QuickBooks file before you attempt that rebuild. I've got an example one that I ran here on this company file so that you guys didn't have to sit with me and wait for it to run. The larger the company file, the longer that this process will take. So that is something to keep in mind if you are wanting to run this on your file. The more data that the file has to read, the longer it will take. In addition, we also want to ensure that we don't have users working in the file while we're attempting this, because QuickBooks will have a hard time trying to read stationary information if we're continuing to add and modify that existing data. So we always recommend making sure that all users have logged out except for the admin user before we attempt to run this service on the file. If I come in here to my results, you can see here it tells me my company file name, the system date. Now in this case, I'm running this on a sample file, so that's why this date looks a little odd. It's a future date. For you guys, it should show a current date. It tells me when I ran the verify and then how many issues were found. And if I scroll down here, I can see the types of issues that are present and where QuickBooks is identifying an issue. I always recommend printing these results so that you have them for reference before you run that rebuild. So that way, after the rebuild is done, we can come back to that verify, run it again, and look to see what the rebuild was able to fix. So again, starting with that verify in order to identify what QuickBooks is showing as an error, running that rebuild as a second option. You can run it straight from your verify results, or again, if I come up here to my file tab into utilities, I can run it from here as well. Once that rebuild is resolved, then we want to go ahead and do an additional verify so that we can compare those results to see if there's still anything showing as an error. So these tools are a great in-product option to help resolve some errors that are causing functionality issues with the QuickBooks file. Another thing that we can do is delete and recreate any kind of customized user roles or logins for QuickBooks. One of the things that I always ask our clients is when they identify issues that are occurring, have they noticed if it's specific to a user or a certain set of users in the file? For example, maybe it's related to all of our sales people who are using QuickBooks, and they have a specific rule that we've created in the company file for them to use. That is a great way, again, to use what's available in the product to try it and help resolve these issues. So if I come in here to our QuickBooks file, I'm going to close out of these verify results. Under our company tab and users, you've got this setup users and roles area. You can see the user list. Right now, there's just an admin user, but any other secondary users your team has in the file would show here. And then we've got our role list that sets the permissions for the users. So that is an additional way if you do notice that the problems occurring are limited to a single login or a certain set of users. This is another way to help identify if it's maybe just a corrupted role or user that is causing the issues. In addition to that, we can also try to see if the corruption is limited to specific data in the QuickBooks file. So on the front end, we can identify if it's maybe a login issue. If it doesn't appear to be a login issue, then is it related to a certain set of data in the system? And by that, it's going to have a similar meaning. Do we see these issues always happening with our customer Fourlane, for example? Every time we enter an invoice for our Fourlane customer, that transaction becomes corrupt and QuickBooks can't read it. What that could mean is that that particular list information is damaged. And in that case, we'd want to create new list information to record data against, and we want to stop recording it against that original data. So that is another easy way to see if it's something related to the information we're putting into QuickBooks, or is it something related to the database itself. Couple more here regarding some methods that we can use to resolve corruption. The next one is a big one that I'm sure a lot of us are already aware of: removing negative inventory from the QuickBooks file. While QuickBooks does allow you to go negative, it unfortunately does not respond well to negative inventory. It can't take the cost of a negative item, since that is not a real or valid thing. So what QuickBooks is trying to do in the background is constantly work to keep the information up to date and the inventory accurate. And every time we have adjustments to account for that negative inventory, QuickBooks is then having to respond to that. So there are a few areas where we can help ensure that we're not allowing negative inventory to show up in the QuickBooks file. If I come back here to our QuickBooks file, the first thing that we can take a look at, if I come in here to our reports tab and down to inventory, you see this report here called negative inventory listing. If I click on that, it will show me anything as of that point in time that has a negative quantity on hand. So you can see here in my sample file, I'm not doing terribly, but we of course would like to see this report not show any items. I've got 3 items right now with a negative quantity. So these are items I would want to respond to remove those negatives from the system. So this is a great starting point. Again, it will tell you immediately as of current what items have a negative quantity. In addition to that, for me, I have an accountant section in my QuickBooks file because I'm in the accountant's version of QuickBooks. For you, most likely, if you're functioning in a non-accountant's version, you can go to your company tab and you'll see an option for the accounting toolbox that will give you these same list of options. But if I come in here to my accountants tab under client data review, I've got this option that says troubleshoot inventory. If I go ahead and click on that, it gives me all my inventory items. And up top, I've got these filters that I can use to give me information specific to my inventory. So as you can see here, what I would want to do is uncheck these additional filters and limit this to just my negative quantity. The next thing I would do is set the date range. So the period that I want to look at to see if there are negatives in the file. And then down below, I have an option to say, was there negative inventory just as of this date, or did the item go negative at any point in time? Our recommendation when we are talking about looking at cleaning up negative inventory is to look at it at any point in time, because even if we clean it up as of current, it doesn't mean that historically that item still didn't go negative and is still having an impact on our item. So as you can see here, for the period I specified, I don't have a negative quantity. If I were to update this date, QuickBooks might yield different results. So if I change this, you can see I changed this to a more current period for this file. And now I've got a handful of items that show they went negative at some point in time during this date range. This is where we would usually go through the process that we call never negative to help get this cleaned up. But again, this is an additional area to see where we have negative inventory that could be causing corruption to our QuickBooks file. The last thing that we would potentially need to look at is if these things above have not been helpful in resolving the corruption, or maybe they've limited certain areas of issues that we're experiencing, but the file operationally is still having problems, then the last thing that we would need to do at that point is look at possibly pursuing a repair through a data service team. That typically involves going through a scoping process for that team to do a complete 360 view of not just the database and the software itself, but also the transactional and financial information in the system to see what is damaged and if the file can be repaired. So again, those first few bullet points are great options in product before we would have to look at using some sort of third-party team to help resolve the issues with the file. So with talking about those methods that we can use to help resolve the corruption in our QuickBooks file, these are just some general best practices that you can use to try to maintain the health of your file. So especially if we go through that work on the front end to get those issues resolved, to get rid of the damage or corruption that our file is experiencing, we want to make sure we're maintaining the health of the file as much as possible. So again, going back to that first option we talked about, running regular verifies. Typically, I have clients who will run them on a monthly basis. Some will run it more frequently, just depending on the amount of data that they're loading into the system on a regular basis. But I would say at minimum monthly is a good frequency to start with. If you do see target chaining errors show up in your verify results, we do not want to proceed to that rebuild. Unfortunately, what can happen is that rebuild utility inside of QuickBooks doesn't respond well to target chaining errors, and it can actually end up hiding those errors and making it seem like they've been fixed in QuickBooks when they have not. So if we do see that error show up in our report, the next best step in that case would be to use a data service team to help get those out of the system. Unfortunately, when it comes to target chaining errors, we need to make sure that we can get those damaged transactions out of the file, ensure the database is clean, and then work through that re-entry of data. The alternative at that point, pending some of the other specs and information regarding the file, would potentially be to look at starting a new file. So just something to keep in mind when we're running those regular verifies is keeping an eye out for if we're seeing target chaining errors. Another thing that we can do is a process called portable round tripping. So one of the other things that you guys might have heard of when talking about the health and functionality of our QuickBooks file are DB file fragments. What those are essentially blocks of our QuickBooks data that have become separated from the file. Typically, and the most reasonable reason that this ends up happening is due to file space and the storage area where we're keeping our file. Usually it doesn't have the bandwidth to support the QuickBooks needs, and so the database ends up breaking apart and having to be stored in other areas. This doesn't necessarily indicate corruption to the QuickBooks file, but it can slow down the performance of the file and make it appear like there's corruption. So doing that portable round tripping is a great way to help ensure that we don't have our information scattered and everything is in a single place talking to each other. Another thing we want to make sure we do is maintain file updates when new releases are available. I see this happen a lot when the QuickBooks software puts out a new release and not everyone who's using QuickBooks updates to that newest release of the software. So those releases are meant to put out fixes to potential things that weren't functioning properly in the software before. So we always want to make sure that everyone who's using QuickBooks and has it installed is updating at the same time. Otherwise, we'll have QuickBooks files on different versions or different releases that are all trying to talk to and use the same data. So that can become problematic for the file. Next thing is checking for negative inventory. We went through those different areas where you can run reports as well as use that troubleshoot inventory area to see where our items are going negative. So keeping a regular review of that to make sure that we're performing cleanup to get those negatives out of the system is crucial. The last thing is reviewing the F2 product information window. If I come back in here to our QuickBooks file and I hit the F2 key on my keyboard, that will bring up this product information window, and it gives you information about the file itself, our file size, our total transactions, targets, which is the detailed information on our transactions, total links, which are connections between transactions, etc. And then over here on the right-hand side, it gives us our list count. So things like our accounts on our chart of accounts, customers, vendors, etc. So it kind of gives us a snapshot view of where the company file currently sits. Pending the version of QuickBooks you're in, again, we're mainly talking about the enterprise variety of QuickBooks. When that file size is between about 1 to 1.5 gigabytes, that's going to be a 7-digit number here. That's when we're starting to be at the max capacity or the recommended threshold for the software. So while the data itself might not be compromised at that point, the more information we're putting into the QuickBooks software and the more we're asking it to work and accommodate that data, the harder it is going to be on the QuickBooks software itself. So making sure that we're doing a regular check here to see how our file is growing, how we're adding data to it is important to know when, again, we could need to look at some of those options to condense our file or possibly start a new file to help ensure we maintain that database. Okay. So thank you guys so much for reviewing what data corruption is in a QuickBooks file, some examples of corruption, how we can work to resolve corruption both within the QuickBooks software as well as what those third-party alternatives are if we need to resort to that. And with that, I appreciate everyone's time. Again, hopefully you guys have some information now to run through those specs on your software to help ensure that we're keeping not just the software and QuickBooks clean, but also the data and financial information that it's housing. We want to ensure that the software is functioning at its fullest capacity so that you guys are getting the most out of it. Thank you guys so much.